Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machida, and we are at episode 5 of our series on Akiva ben Joseph and the birth of the Rabbinic canon or the Rabbinic Bible. And so far, we've gone over the history of the first revolt, how Pharisaism was able to survive through the craftiness of Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai, where he was able to secure the safety of a city called Jamnia or Yavne, and that became a rabbinic school and a center for Judaism after the disastrous consequences of the first revolt. In another episode, we looked closer at Jamnia, and we saw the myth of the Council of Jamnia, and I think we pretty much showed that that myth is just that. It's a myth. In fact, it hasn't really been a live option for well over 50 years in biblical scholarship. Nevertheless, it was a very important center. It was the Sanhedrin, and the authority of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin was transferred to Jamnia. And one figure who rises to prominence at this time is the person we're focusing on, Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph. Now, there were two paths that were available after the destruction of the temple, because at that point, Judaism could no longer practice the old covenant as it's stipulated in the book of Moses or the books of Moses. And so something had to change. This tension was intolerable. So either the Jews had to reassert autonomy in the Holy Land through a second revolt, rebuild the temple, and regain the sacrifices and that covenantal continuity that had existed prior to the first revolt, or it had to redefine itself in a way that was a religion of the book. And in the last episode, we looked at Bar Kokhba revolt, and then we began to look at Jewish redefinition. And that's where we're going to drill further down exactly how this happened. We talked last episode about how Rabbi Akiva was responsible for selecting which oral traditions were to be included in writing and preserved, and those that weren't preserved disappear. Ultimately, they're irrevocably gone because they never were written. And once that oral tradition had stopped, they disappeared. But what we're going to find out is that something similar happens with the various Hebrew texts that were in circulation in the first century. Rabbi Akiva selects a single standardized text, and that's what Rabbinic Judaism built upon. And just as the oral traditions disappeared after certain ones were encoded, the other text, and I would say the other canons as well, disappear. And ultimately, the only thing left standing is Akiva's canon, the text that he has. But we're going a little bit ahead of ourselves. In this episode, we're going to look at why Akiva had to address sacred scripture in such a way and establish an authoritative text. So that's what's coming up today on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So strap yourselves in, because it is about to begin right now. So after the first revolt and the destruction of the temple, Judaism was placed in intolerable tension in that it was unable to live in continuity with the Old Covenant, since the Old Covenant assumes a functioning priesthood, a standing temple or tabernacle, ongoing animal sacrifices, all of this for the atonements of sin. And the whole system is tied to the cult, the sacrifice, the temple. With the temple destroyed, there was a radical need to redefine Judaism. And as Louis Finkelstein notes in his book on Akiva,
Akiva was trying to change the complexion of the inherited law. To accomplish this, he had to find an authority superior to that of his predecessors and accepted by everyone. Only one instrument could fulfill those requirements: Scripture itself. Louis Finkelstein, Akiva, scholar, saint, and martyr.
So, in order to reform Judaism and bring it into what later becomes Rabbinic Judaism, Akiva needed flexibility. And one obstacle to that flexibility was just the inherited traditions that were handed on. In last episode, we talked about how he handled the oral traditions, but there is also the written tradition, the scripture. And the scripture itself seemed to pose an obstacle for Akiva because Akiva couldn't make all these practical changes and definitions apart from the authority of scripture, but scripture is set in writing. So what he does is he uses what he learned from his predecessor and developed a way of reading sacred scripture that you could read vast amounts of halakot, you can read vast amounts of meaning into the text by focusing on the particular eccentricities of the written text. And here John Bowman explains,
"It was a mighty key that Rabbi Akiva provided to unlock the Torah, so that a never-ending stream of halakoth could be derived from it. The written Torah, thanks to R. Akiva, kept its central place in Judaism without its hampering the development of the oral law. He supplied the principles for justifying this abandoning of absolute reliance on tradition without breaking with the alleged fount of all tradition." John Bowman, The Fourth Gospel and the Jews, a study in R. Akiva, Esther, and the Gospel of John.
So it's the interpretation of scripture that Akiva uses to read vast amounts of meaning into it. And since it is in some way informed based on scripture, Akiva can claim the authority of scripture. And here Finkelstein explains more in detail.
Akiva's mode of interpretation of scripture is a development of that which he derived from his master Nahum of Gimzo. Superfluous letters, words, and verses were the meat whereon he thrived. By the use of them he was able to read his whole juristic program into scriptures. But what he called superfluous words would hardly seem such to us. The juxtaposition of the various chapters had a meaning which must be discovered. He rejected the old Hillelite principle of inference by generalization from particulars, and replaced it with a curious and complicated rule of his own invention which he called inclusion and limitation. Neither rhetoric nor grammar offered a bar to his imaginative argument. Indeed, were we to accept at face value the technical reasons he gave for his decisions, we should be forced to the conclusion that, far from being the greatest of the Talmudists, he was simply a brilliant example of extraordinary but wasted ingenuity. But the rules which he derived through his curious and intricate logic are so reasonable that when we examine them we are even more impressed with his judgment as a jurist than with his skill as debater. It is obvious that he considered the interpretation of the written law merely the form which had to be followed in the derivation of desirable rules from the biblical text. Finkelstein, Akiva, scholar, saint, and martyr. 193.
So Akiva's method of inclusion and limitations enables him to read vast amounts of his own interpretation into scripture, yet at the same time claiming that is scripture itself that is teaching this in a kind of coded way. In other words, all the tiny little details that were on the written text, little eccentricities, letters that were included that ought not be there, or certain phenomenon like that, Akiva was able to look at that in the text and say, see, the text is directing us to mean this from this peculiarity, which is genius, as Finkelstein notes. And it enables Judaism to become a radically different entity that it was prior to the destruction of the temple, because now Judaism can function without being hampered by scripture and without being hampered by oral tradition. It's just a matter of reading interpretations into a particular text, a particular Hebrew text, I should know. And this is, I'm not exaggerating the importance of this. In fact, there's a wonderful video out. I'm going to show the video, then we're going to go through the text itself. It's called Bim Bam, and it's a group of Jewish artists who are taking things from Jewish tradition and putting into a kind of cartoon form. And so I want to watch a clip of this. This is from a portion of the, I believe it's Babylonian Talmud, Menachot 29b. And I think this is a very telling passage for us to understand about Akiva's interpretative methodology and how this makes Akiva like a new Moses. In fact, this is a fictional dialogue between God and Moses where he actually sees Akiva. So we'll watch the clip from Bim Bam. This is from bimbam.com.
Studio Podcast.
6 days in San Francisco, 6 stories, 12 artists.
Studio Godcast.
When Moses ascended to the heavens, he saw the letters of the Torah that he had received from God and given to the Jewish people. Each letter had been perfect and carefully crafted according to God's instructions. But now there was a crown on the letter Tzadzi he'd worked so hard on. And wasn't the letter Ayin perfect the way it was?
Hey, God, what's going on here? Why are you attaching these things to our letters?
God explained to Moses that these symbols were crowns. In the future, people would be building and expanding the text he'd received.
Can you show me?
Many years after your time, God said, there will come a man named Akiva ben Yosef who will be a great teacher to thousands of students. His lessons and insights will crown your words. In times to come, people will learn our laws and build on them. They will interpret them for the times and make sure they will last. Moses was confused. The students were learning a law that he did not recognize. What had become of his teaching?
Rabbi, I'm confused about the source of this law. How do we know we're supposed to do it this way? Where does it come from?
We learn this from the text in the Torah. It was given to Moses at Mount Sinai and passed down in oral tradition. It's our job to learn and expand it.
Everything was rooted in those words given from God, and the law expanded with the crowns.
So if there will be such a great teacher, why did you give the Torah to me?
But God told him, "Be silent, for this is what I have decided."
What a great teacher. He must have gotten such a wonderful reward.
Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad.
Master of the universe. Such Torah. And such a reward?
But God told him, "Be silent, for this is what I have decided."
Okay, so I think this cartoon does a very good job representing the text, although there are a couple of fuzzy points on there that I think going through the text will help clarify. So let's do it. Here's the text that the cartoon was based on, and it says this: Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high and he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns to the letters of the Torah. So all these interesting eccentricities that are tied to the text. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds upon mounds of holocaust. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, well, let's stop there. That's interesting. So God tells Moses in this story that the reason why there are these strange things added to the various letters is specifically for Akiva. Okay. I think that's striking in and of itself. So what Akiva pulls out is basically divine revelation just as much as the actual words of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, return behind you. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row of Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned and he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. So here you have Moses sitting in the back of Akiva's study hall, trying to follow his teaching. And now he's doubting whether the Torah was really sufficient. He has self-doubt about what he revealed to Israel in light of what Akiva's teaching is. Let that sink in a little bit too. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, my teacher, from where do you derive this? Rabbi Akiva said to them, it is a halakha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive. Moses returned and came before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said before him, Master of the universe, you have a man as great as this, and yet you still chose to give the Torah through me? In other words, Moses is saying, wow, Akiva is so great, yet you gave the Torah to little o' me? So Moses actually feels inferior to Akiva. Why? God said to him, be silent. This intention arose before me. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, you have shown me Rabbi Akiva's Torah. Now show me his reward. God said to him, return to where you were. Moses went back and saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop, as Akiva was tortured to death by the Romans. Moses said before him, Master of the universe, this is Torah, and this is its reward. God said to him, be silent. This intention arose before me. So I think there are a few striking details that come from this passage. First, you can see the prestige that Akiva has, that Akiva is almost superior to Moses. In fact, Moses seems inferior when he compares the Torah that he received compared to Akiva's Torah. The other thing too is that notice how all the tiny little details within the text of the Torah is actually another Torah that's encrypted into the text. So Akiva could claim that he gets it from the Torah, even though really what he's doing is he's reading vast amounts of halakha into things that were probably accidental to the text. It could be scribal errors, it could be anything. But notice the only way that Akiva's interpretation, Akiva's methodology of inclusion and limitation could work is if there is a single standardized Hebrew text tradition, because if you remember what we talked about in previous episodes, in the first century, there was a pluriformity of various text and versions of the text in circulation amongst all the Jews. And in fact, we also noted that there was a pluriformity of Jewish sects that also apparently held to different canons as well. And these texts that you might be familiar with, of course, there's the Hebrew text that the rabbis ultimately have in its earlier state or form. This is known as the Proto-MT or Proto-Masoretic text. There's also the Septuagint, often depicted simply by the Roman numerals for 70, LXX. This is a pre-Christian Jewish translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And that started roughly about 200 BC and it continued on from there. That was widely circulated, not only in Judea, but also, of course, in the diaspora to Jews outside of Palestine. You also have the Proto-Theodosian version, which is basically a kind of Greek text that's a little closer to the Hebrew text. There's the Samaritan Pentateuch. There's also various Aramaic targums that were written in the first century. We see some of these targums in Qumran. Probably almost all of them are lost. So we don't have, the earliest targums that we have from the first century are those that are found in Qumran. And then, of course, you have the evidence from Qumran itself that also shows that there were other Hebrew text traditions, Hebrew versions out there of various books in circulation in the first century. So after the destruction of the temple, there's a variety of text traditions out there. And Akiva needs to be able to use the authority of Scripture in order to use his method of inclusion and limitation to read all these meanings into the text. So he adopts as a standard text what becomes the Hebrew Masoretic text. And just like with oral tradition, where only the traditions that Akiva wrote down were preserved and the rest were forgotten, I believe something similar happens here, that Rabbinic Judaism picks one particular text group, that is the Masoretic text, and goes with that. And so the copying of all these various different text traditions and so on within Judaism pretty much peters out, or it begins to peter out, and these other text traditions get forgotten. So much so that by the time you get to Jerome in the 4th century, all he has is one Hebrew text in existence, and that is the Masoretic text, the ultimate text that we get in the great codices of St. Petersburg and Aleppo. And of course, the Samaritans continue to copy the Samaritan Pentateuch, and Christians continue to copy the Greek Septuagint. So these are the texts that come out of the Second Jewish Revolt. So I think there's prima facie claim here that even though we don't have a direct text where it says, and Akiva chose this text from among the many texts, I think you can see with this interpretive method that it would require a standardized text, or at least an authorized particular form of the text. That's probably a better way to put it. And once that becomes the authorized form, of course, attention to all the other texts disappear. So I think on the surface, we certainly could see where Akiva would be instrumental in choosing this text. But there is more evidence that Akiva really did make an effort to make this particular text the standard text for Rabbinic Judaism. And remember, Rabbinic Judaism, we're talking second Christian century. This is a post-Christian Judaism. This is a Judaism that no longer has a functioning temple, that is radically redefining itself, that the head rabbi Akiva, remember, he was the one who chose a false Messiah and unleashed persecution on the Christians, ultimately almost destroys Judaism itself. And I think that hints at that last part in the passage we just read. Moses says, well, I'm sure he's going to have a fantastic reward for this new Torah he gave, when actually Akiva gets martyred, he gets burned to death. by the Romans, which is yet another tension with Akiva, where Akiva is held in incredibly high esteem within Judaism, but he has some bad points as well. For example, he identified somebody as a Messiah who wasn't, so he's a false prophet with a false Messiah. He also ends up creating enormous devastation by backing the Bar Kokhba revolt and almost extinguishing Judaism itself, with himself ending up as a martyr. So there are some very powerful reasons why someone would have doubts whether Akiva really is this kind of second Moses. So we're going to park it right there. And when we come back, I'm going to show you some evidence that Akiva actually does orchestrate this change with the authorized scripture text for Judaism from that point onwards. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. If so, please like, subscribe. Also, William Albrecht and myself are available on Patreon. We appreciate your support in order to buy materials so that we can make videos and do in-depth research in this area. So until next time, I'm Gary Michuta. I hope everybody has a great week.